We're now talking about qualitative research, the research that depends on words and not on numbers, or it has maybe limited use of numbers and no inferential statistics. And of course you can see your reading assignment here, and you'll see that my coverage of this is relatively low. And the reason for that is simply that you all, I think most of you who take this class, are required to take classes in Indigenous research, and you'll cover a lot of qualitative methods there, so I'm not going to dive deeply here. You'll have Dr. Ami primarily, who has excellent expertise in this area. Get an overview. So let's define quantitative and qualitative research. So quantitative research, well, first off, quantity means numbers, so it's focused on numbers, and it begins with a focused research question or hypothesis. And then it collects data from a sample of individuals, relatively small sample, and uses statistical techniques to analyze the data, and then generalizes to a population or draws conclusions about a population based on the sample data. Qualitative research, well, let's think of quality equaling words. And so it begins with it might begin with a less focused research question. It's more exploratory in nature. And we would collect large amounts of verbal data from usually a smaller number of individuals. We'll describe the data using non-statistical techniques, such as in the grounded theory model that we'll look at shortly. And the concern is not primarily about generalizing. The concern is not about drawing conclusions about a population. Instead, it's about the experiences of the sample, the individuals that were included in the sample. So I have an example here. This is a study that says, in the aftermath of teenage suicide, a qualitative study of the psychosocial consequences for the surviving family members. So you can see the background. They're looking at family reactions following teenage suicide, such an incredibly hard topic, and yet such an important group to understand better so that we can help them. And so they have realized that it's hard to find a sample that's unbiased, but they used a small series of cases to understand what it is to lose a teenage family member to suicide. And this will help with giving support in the grief process. And so how did they study this? Well, they had there had been a project on teenage unnatural death in Sweden, and there were 88 suicides among those deaths. And so they identified 13 cases from 1995 to 98, and everything they did was retrospective. People were looking back, and 10 families agreed to participate. And they used an open interview method 15 to 25 months after the suicide. So they just talked to them, which seems like a very respectful way. The information gathered was manually analyzed according to a grounded theory model. And we'll look at what this means, resulting in allocation of data into one of three domains, post-suicidal reactions, impact on daily living, and families' need for support. And so they found out what's going on with these people, to put it in a nutshell, and what kinds of things that they had and needed. And then they used this to draw a conclusion about what we can do to support the families, and in particular the younger siblings they mentioned. So the purpose of this research then is to generate novel and interesting research questions, to provide detailed descriptions of behaviors of groups and individuals in specific situations, like the families we just talked about, and to communicate firsthand experiences of members of particular groups, again, like the one we just talked about, and also like the sexual minority teens in one of the previous lectures. So just a little bit of quality between qualitative and quantitative. In qualitative, we're looking at in-depth information about relatively few people, compared with quantitative, less deep information, but more people. In qualitative, we base our conclusions on interpretations drawn by the investigator, so it's what we call subjective. The conclusions might differ depending on who's looking at the information. And in quantitative, the conclusions are based on statistical analyses. And finally, qualitative is global, means it's really broad and it's exploratory. It's trying to find out the basic information, whereas quantitative is specific and focused on a particular hypothesis. The way we collect data is we use interviews, one-to-one conversations between researchers and participants, and those could be unstructured, meaning we have a few ideas of what we're going to ask them, but we let the conversation go where it goes. Structured interviews, just the opposite. The interview follows a strict script and they can't deviate. They can't say anything other than what's on the script. And most common is semi-structured interviews. The interviewer has some consistent questions and makes sure to ask them, but the sequence might vary, follow-up questions might vary, so it can be varied from the structure of the question. Another way is to use focus groups, which are small groups of people who participate in one interview session with the researcher. So they sit in a group and talk about this particular topic together. And this is effective at getting more information, like people can think of more ideas in the group sometimes. But the risks are there can be people who dominate the conversation, and we also know about groupthink, which is a tendency for groups of people to converge on a single conclusion. People's minds might be changed by the presence of the group. The data are analyzed a little differently, as you can guess, because they're verbal, open-ended responses. There's a lot of words. And so depending on the question asked, there are quite a few techniques for analyzing these data. There are even statistical tools that will help you to sort the data and group it as needed. But one common technique is grounded theory, and that's what was mentioned in our first study about the families of suicide, teens who committed suicide. And this is grounded theory. The researcher examines the responses of participants and uses common themes identified in the responses to form a theory. So the researcher does just a lot of reading. And then if they see one family mention something and see another one mentions the same thing, this is like the grounding that they use and then they pull more evidence and see if in general this theory is supported by what all of the families said. A theoretical narrative will support their interpretation. So in other words, they have these themes that they're then looking for, and then that can help them interpret the data. A quick example here of some findings for this and what this would look like is a grounded theory study it's titled, "And You're Telling Me Not to Stress?" A grounded theory study of postpartum depression symptoms among low-income mothers. And the themes that they identified became their theoretical narrative, and they found a theme of ambivalence, and then some things that people said directly from what their respondents said. I wasn't prepared for this baby. I didn't want to have any more children. There's a theme of caregiving overload, and the words that were said are, "Please stop crying. I need a break. I can't do this anymore. These mamas were tired. They're juggling things. I have no time to breathe. Everyone depends on me navigating the maze." So they're really feeling a lot of stress from this. Mothering alone. I really don't have any help. My baby has no father. So this feeling of isolation, and then real life worry. I don't have any money. Will my baby be okay? It's not safe here. Oh my gosh. So really some painful themes emerging from this narrative about the lived experience and postpartum depression in low-income mothers. So there are problems with both approaches. Quantitative studies can be too linear, like they're focusing on A causing B, when really life isn't always like that. There are lots of causal factors, and we don't have A causes B as such a direct relationship. Secondly, we might consider it too reductionist. And what we mean by that is that complex human behavior is reduced to just numbers. And it's sort of like a health model that says when you're not feeling well, just identifies one organ linked in it, when in reality the whole body is connected together. And then finally, we overlook the richness of human behavior. There's a lot there, and we are just focusing so narrow, we're missing the human side of it. The qualitative downsides, that is word research based on words, is that it's not generalizable. We can't infer to a population because we don't have any of these controls in place to make sure that our data are representing a population. Secondly, it's not objective. So if you took all the data about those mothers and you analyzed it, you might come up with different theories that emerge. And so it's subjective, relying on the subjective experience of the individual studies and the subjective interpretation of the researcher. And finally, their reliability and validity for those reasons is also compromised. So what should we do? Do we have to choose one or the other? Or can we use both? And there are two approaches that use both excellent approaches. First is a mixed methods approach. In that option, we take qualitative studies, so we explore the topic of interest using these interviews, and from what people tell us, we design an experiment or a quantitative approach. So the qualitative approach is used for hypothesis generation, and the quantitative approach is used for hypothesis testing. A second mixed method approach would start with quantitative, some sort of experiment, and then follow up with qualitative. So we would have a hypothesis and test it, but we would talk to participants afterwards and better understand the statistical results. What was the experience of these individuals during the study, or how did they explain their own reactions? And Milgram did use that approach in his study of obedience. So he definitely interviewed people afterwards. A second method is a triangulated approach. We use both qualitative and quantitative approaches to answer a single question. You might be saying that that sounds redundant, but it's not quite redundant, because in the mixed methods approach, we're using these sequentially. A follows B. And then the triangulated approach, we're using both methods at the same time, and we're using them to support each other. We're not using one to form the other.